Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this episode of Horns, we listen to a talk by David French, author of Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. French details the way in which the United States has become increasingly polarized, politically, geographically, culturally, and examines what he considers to be the threat of secession that's posed by the increasing enmity with which people who hold alternative political views are regarded. French makes the case that in order to unite the country, that we need to find causes and ways of interacting with each other that focus on bringing each other together and finding common ground rather than bringing us further apart. This discussion was part of the University of Texas celebration of Free Speech Week. Let's listen in.
Good day, everybody. My name is Will Inbud, and Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security, and honored to welcome all of you today to our webinar with David French to help kick off the University of Texas's Free Speech Week. Now, it's a daunting thing to have to introduce your boss, the man who signs your paycheck, but that is my privilege here to welcome Jay Hartzell, President of the University of Texas, Austin. He's just been in the job for a few months, but I think anybody who's been following campus and national news knows that it's been quite a challenging few months. And I've just got to say that Jay has navigated these many challenges with a deft hand, with a happy heart, with a cheerful spirit, and has very quickly earned the trust and affection of just about all of us here on campus. And among other things, while managing many crises, he's also spearheaded UT to take a leading role in observing Free Speech Week with a whole range of activities on campus this week. So, Mr. President, going to turn it over to you to share some thoughts and introduce our guest speaker.
Great, thanks, Will. And I'll tell you, if you were worried about the introduction, you did a great job. So, just more glowing praise is always good. And I will repeat the favor introducing David French. I'm really pleased that Clements Center and David are participating in kicking off our participation in Free Speech Week. David has an amazing record. I was reading his bio and made me feel a little bit inadequate, but at the same time, very happy to have him here. I was lucky enough to get a copy of his most recent book last week and started reading this weekend. And I know that for those of you that are here today and that get a chance to go on and read it, you'll find it thought-provoking and interesting and insightful. For me, I was telling him before we joined this, he put a label and started talking about and articulating a lot of things that I had felt in many ways. And so it was really helpful to me to frame up many of the issues I think we're facing. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about David. David is a senior editor for The Dispatch and was formerly a senior writer for the National Review. He's a New York Times bestselling author, and his next book, Divided We Fall, it says will be published, but I saw it on Amazon earlier today. So I think you can go ahead and get it now by St. Martin's Press this year. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and the past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and a former lecturer at Cornell Law School. We're going to work on UT Law School next, David. That's something we can work on. He served as senior counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice and the Alliance Defending Freedom. He's a former major in the United States Army Reserve. In 2007, he was deployed to Iraq, serving in Diyala Province as a squadron judge advocate for the 2nd Squadron, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. He lives and works in Franklin, Tennessee, with his wife, Nancy, and his 3 children. With that, thank you, Will, for hosting this. Thank you, David, for taking part, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much. I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this. And in your intro, the discussion of what a year to start. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it says already this year, it was a New York Times podcast that said already this year we've been through a 1998, which is an impeachment, a 1918, which is a pandemic, a 1968 level of urban unrest, and hopefully we don't go through a whole bunch of 2000s in different states with the sort of the Bush v. Gore recount. So it's been quite a year. And I also want to say, I don't know what Room Rater has said about my SEC heavy background and my alternative life. I'm a sports podcaster. But I have to just pretend that I'm one. So I'm just going to apologize for the microaggression of the Southeastern Conference stadiums and arenas in the background here. But I have 2 kids at the other UT, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Was born at Auburn, which is one of the other stadiums, and grew up in Kentucky. So I just have to do it. All right. let's talk about a book. Let's talk about the book I wrote called Divided We Fall, that is out. It is in your local bookstore. It's on Amazon, wherever you buy books. And it contains the S word in the title, America's secession threat. Why would I use that word? Is our polarization really that bad that we need to worry about this? Am I being ridiculously alarmist? Well, I don't think so. Now, I'm not saying right away. I'm not saying anytime. I'm not saying in 2020, although we can potentially foresee a constitutional crisis in 2020 regarding disputed mail-in ballots, for example. I'm not saying that it is imminent, but what I'm saying is that our divisions in our country are growing so profound and so deep and bitter. That's a key word, bitter, angry, that we need to start prioritizing the union of this country in our political discourse, not just the triumph of our side over the other side. And the central thesis of the book is that there is no single cultural, political, religious, social trend that is pulling Americans together more than it's pushing us apart. That all of the important strands of our lives, significant national trends in our lives, are pulling us apart, and they're pulling us apart in a particularly dangerous way. So let's kind of walk through this step by step. Do we tend to live around people that we disagree with? That's one of the things that kind of helps deal with polarization, is if you have friends who are of opposing viewpoints, people who you know and you love and you trust, who have disagreements with you about politics. Well, there's this interesting phenomenon that's happened in the United States of America called the big sort. And with the big sort, this is a term coined by Bill Bishop in outstanding 2009 book. What it says is that Americans are clustering into like-minded enclaves, that we tend to now live around people of like mind more than in the past. And in fact, in 2016, more Americans lived in what are called landslide counties. Counties where one political party wins on a presidential ballot by 20 points or more than really any time since we've been able to measure this statistic. So you live in these landslide counties. You're surrounded by people of like mind. And some of these communities are what you might call super clusters. It's not just that there's a 60-40 gap between one candidate and another. It might be 80-20. It might be 90-10. So let's take one of the most famous examples from 2016, the white evangelical community, which is disproportionately clustered in the Southeast, and awful lot of folks in Texas. 81% of them voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. And again, they're disproportionately clustered in specific American communities. That is what you would call a super cluster of like-minded people. But is it only red? No, not at all. If you go to blue areas of the country, even higher percentages of people voted for Hillary Clinton in Manhattan, in DC, where the percentage was over 90% that voted for Clinton, San Francisco, LA, Philadelphia, the core urban areas of Philadelphia. All of these places are ideological superclusters where people are surrounded as a general matter by people of like mind. Now, in isolation, is that a problem? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but in practice, it turns out to be. Now, why is this? So I'm gonna throw terms at you for a while. So, term number one, big sort, clustering into enclaves, communities of like mind. So that's term number one. That's at work. Term number two, law of group polarization. This one, if you remember nothing about what I say today, nothing, remember the law of group polarization. So what does the law of group polarization mean? The law of group polarization, this comes from Cass Sunstein in a 1999 academic paper. This is, guys, why you need to be reading academic papers, because sometimes they have kernels of remarkable truth within them. And so Cass Sunstein in 1999 wrote an academic paper where he collected a mountain of research and said, when people of like mind gather, they tend to grow more extreme. So let's take whatever the issue is. Let's suppose you are in support of gun rights and opposed to gun control. And 6 of you gather for dinner. You're eating outside, carefully socially distanced, et cetera, and you're talking about gun rights. You're talking about the guns that you own, You're talking about gun control proposals that you don't like. And what Sunstein says is that when that group of like-minded people get together, they're going to end up more extreme in their view than when they started. And in certain circumstances, you can even get to a cascade effect where the entire group ends up more extreme than the most extreme person at the start of the discussion. Let's say you're getting together and you're talking about the urgency of confronting climate change, and you're all in agreement upon this. Let's say you're getting together for a very good Bible study. As I say to heavily Christian audiences, I say, how many of you have gone to a really good Bible study and left it loving Jesus less? When like-minded people gather, they tend to grow more extreme in their views. So does this reflect in a lot of the political data that we see about Americans' viewpoints? Absolutely. One of the things that is true is that the our two great political parties, great as in size, not necessarily great as in quality, but our two political parties have been moving further apart from each other ideologically. And what used to be the sort of bell curve where you had a big bulk of Americans in the ideological middle and a smaller number of Americans at the ideological edges is beginning to flatten. This is a natural consequence of people who live together having a like mind, and that like mind growing more extreme. So that means that we don't live next to each other as a general rule. We're decreasingly believing the same things. And interestingly, we're also decreasingly enjoying the same popular culture. In 2016, as part of sort of this effort that a lot of journalists undertook to try to understand other parts of America after a huge surprise in the presidential election, the New York Times took a deep dive statistically into the geography of television ratings. So what do we watch? And it turns out that, of course, our media is fragmented. We don't have 3 channels anymore. We're not all watching the same stuff. Even the most popular stuff would be not that popular 30 years ago relative to the ratings. But what's remarkable is a lot of these shows map onto our political division. So if you look at for example, I loved Game of Thrones while it was on. Slightly disappointed at the ending, but I loved Game of Thrones. But I remember looking at the viewer map for Game of Thrones, and it looked a lot like the Hillary Clinton map. So if you were watching Game of Thrones, there was a very good chance you were also a Hillary Clinton voter. But there's nothing about Game of Thrones that implies support for a Democrat for president. But nevertheless, that was the reality. And what hyper-violent dystopian show did Republicans tend to watch? Much more The Walking Dead. And you could just go down the line that what you watch tracked onto our political divisions in a pretty remarkable way, so that a show that might have 10 million viewers, they're not spread out equally across red and blue divides. They're clustered. Are you around people who think the same? You're around people who watch the same things within your subgroup? And then also, there's been a lot of talk about America secularizing. But we're not secularizing at the same rate in the same places. And guess what? This tracks along the red-blue divide. If you're in San Francisco, a super cluster of Democrats, it's much less church-heavy than where I live in Franklin, Tennessee, which is close to, not quite a super cluster, but close to a super cluster of Republicans. You could drive down the street in Franklin, Tennessee, and if someone said to you that America was secularizing, you would wonder what on earth they were talking about, because everywhere you look, you can't drive down Franklin without a mega church, at least in your peripheral vision. So politically, culturally, religiously, we're dividing, and we're dividing along those red-blue divides, with the much more secular areas tending to be voting blue, much more religious areas tending to be voting red. And so what does this mean? Well, it means as we begin to separate, as we begin to develop these different subcultures, we often even now lack the ability to talk to each other, to even communicate. So some of you have heard, here's the third term. So term number 1 was big sort. Term number 2 is law of group polarization. Term number 3 is Overton window. And what is an Overton window? It's a term named after a think tank, a scholar in a think tank in Michigan called the Mackinac Center. But it's essentially the boundary of acceptable discourse. And so as the Overton window shifts, you can often win the culture even by losing, say, a partisan political race, so long as you can shift that boundary, what's acceptable. For example, it used to be totally within the Overton window in American discourse to engage in slurs, racial or ethnic or slurs based on sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. That used to be within the Overton window. It's now decidedly not. And that's a positive change. But what's interesting is that the Overton window, rather than sort of having one Overton window, as red and blue separate, I would submit we're moving into two Overton windows, where speech that is completely acceptable in one is verboten in the other. And, a lot of people talk about left-wing political correctness. Well, I submit that there is political correctness on the right as well. There are arguments you can make on the right or to the right, from the right, that are just out of bounds, that they would exclude you from that community. It's interesting. One of the interesting phenomena of our modern cultural conflict is that both sides, one of the reasons why it's so intense is both sides tend to think they're losing. And if you point to certain cultural developments, there's reasons to believe that. For example, my former colleague at National Review said, if you're going to track the last 40 years of American cultural struggle and American cultural conflict, you would say America has become more pro-gun, more pro-gay, and more pro-life. Pro-life laws have proliferated. The abortion rate and ratio have declined precipitously in the last 30, 40 years. Gun laws have changed dramatically in the last 30, 40 years, liberalized dramatically in the last 30, 40 years. And America's LGBT citizens have enjoyed a much greater range of protections from workplace discrimination, have, through the Obergefell decision, have a constitutional right to same-sex marriage now. So there has been large cultural change, some benefiting and advanced by the cultural left, some advanced by the cultural right. But each advance by one side feels like an affront, feels like an attack. And so you have both sides that feel like they're losing, both sides decreasingly able to talk to each other, both sides becoming more extreme. And remember the geography. Living in these large geographic regions of like-minded Americans. The red and blue divide is not sprinkled equally around the country. The Pacific West is a uniform blue wall. Oregon, Washington, Oregon, California, blue, blue, blue. Huge, powerful region in the country. New England, increasingly, a very deep blue area. The South and large chunks of the Midwest, very, very red, and have been red for a very long time. So you've got these geographically distinct regions that are culturally distinct, that are growing apart from each other culturally. And here's the last thing. There's increasing animosity. And this increasing animosity is creating a threat to liberty. And I know this is Free Speech Week, and this is where it gets in. We're going to dive a bit into the free speech issues. So what ends up happening is then, as we become more alienated from each other, as we become more extremely alienated from each other, and as a result, enmity and bitterness rise, we begin to see the exercise of our opponent's liberty not as a value add to the American body politic, not as part of a marketplace of ideas where sort of the better ideas will, in this churn and in this give and take, the better ideas will emerge. We begin to see the exercise of free speech as a threat. Why a threat? Because if our opponent speaks and people are persuaded, they're being persuaded to a side that is increasingly different from us, one that is increasingly seen as extreme and one that is increasingly seen as distasteful. And so one of the things that I would argue is that this enmity becomes the enemy of liberty. So enmity is the enemy of liberty because we no longer value it. We don't have that sort of John Stuart Mill sense that said, look, free speech is a benefit to me. If I hear speech that demonstrates to me that I'm wrong, then I've benefited. I've gone from error to truth, and we all want that. Or if I hear free speech even that I disagree with and still continue to disagree with, well, it's benefited me in a couple of ways. One, it's sharpened my own argument. It's pointed out perhaps the flaws in my own argument that I could better articulate truth. And it's also educated me. It's educated me about what political opponents believe. I understand them better. So I'm sharper in my own arguments. I have greater understanding of my opponents. But now we look at it and we say, it is a threat to us. And don't think for a moment this is just a one way that this hostility to free speech is just coming from one side of the aisle. We live in an interesting paradox right now. Right now, free speech law in the United States is probably in a better position than it's been in the history of the US. You have more freedom from government interference with your freedom of expression right now than you've ever had in American history, according to the legal doctrine. But at the same time, a lot of Americans don't feel free. They don't feel like they can speak into contentious topics. And part of the reason for that is a cultural antipathy to free speech. I'll give you two examples. One from the involving antipathy towards speech from the left, one involving antipathy towards speech from the right. On the right, the case of James Damore at Google became quite a cause a couple of years ago. He was a libertarian-leaning software guy who wrote a manifesto. Google had solicited ideas. We want to hear ideas about how to diversify and have more gender equity in our workplace. And Damore articulated the reasons why he believed there wasn't gender equity and how you could achieve gender equity without engaging in gender discrimination. And it was a libertarian point of view. He had some contentious claims about how women may be less interested in pursuing computer science degrees than men, and perhaps some reasons why that was. And it created a big uproar, created a big debate. Well, the debate was fine, but then Google fired him. And the right side of the political aisle said, look at how intolerant Google is. They can't abide good faith disagreement. They can't abide good faith disagreement, even on, this is a contentious issue, yes, but can't people have a good faith give and take about these issues? And they fired him. And look how intolerant Silicon Valley is. And it was, I believe, an intolerant action. But then after James Damore goes through his ordeal, a football player, you all know his name, and several others, Colin Kaepernick, he had kneeled before Damore, but he was continuing to kneel. Other players were beginning to kneel, not that many, a few. And the president of the United States looked at this, and at a rally in Alabama, or I believe it's just maybe in the Florida Panhandle, says, fire them, fire them. Well, you would think that the right had just condemned cancel culture. So they're going to say, no, Mr. President, I might disagree with Colin Kaepernick and these kneeling players, but I don't think they should lose their jobs because of it. No, instead, there was the roar of the crowd. Yeah, fire them. So what it demonstrated to me is that our enmity, the distaste, the disgust that we have for our political opponents is overwhelming our commitment to liberty. And that we tend to use liberty not so much as a value, but as a weapon, where we seek our own speech, free speech for me, but not for thee. So why secession? Why get to that word? The bottom line is these trends cannot continue forever without creating real problems. We in the United States do not get to take a vacation from the laws of human nature. We have historical experience that shows that when like-minded people cluster in geographic enclaves and believe their distinct culture is under threat, that we will react in that way, and that blundering and foolish leadership can exacerbate the crisis. And that's one of the things that we have seen around us this year, as we have seen leadership exacerbating crises rather than using their power and their influence to unite and to calm as much as possible. And so when you have geographically distinct, culturally distinct entities that believe their way of life is under threat, people tend to react accordingly. Again, not right away. It's not imminent. But there is nothing that says that a geographically diverse, ethnically diverse, religiously diverse nation is going to remain permanently united in the face of such divisions. And so quickly, I'll say, you might be saying, yeah, okay, I get it. I get it. We got a problem. What do we do about it? Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, I have some policy ideas in there. One, we absolutely need to rediscover our shared commitment to the fundamental American social compact contained in the Bill of Rights and the Civil War amendments that extend the blessings of liberty to all Americans. One of the things that has caused our current unrest is that we in the last 25, 30 years have really relaxed our commitment to the Bill of Rights when it comes to policing. And that has led to incidents of police brutality. And in some departments, not all, but in some, a culture of impunity. And that there are ways to deal with this by doubling down on our commitment to due process, to protection from unreasonable search and seizures or cruel and unusual punishment, that we can begin to lower the temperature of dissent in communities that have been historically faced disproportionately violent policing tactics or disproportionately exploitive policing tactics, phenomenon like policing for profit, civil asset forfeiture. These are things that contradict the language of the Bill of Rights, and we need to rediscover the Bill of Rights. We also need to de-escalate national politics. As much as possible, we need people to have a degree of control over their own lives where they're not dependent on a deadlocked Washington to deliver for them, or that it's increasing centralization is often a threat to a nation that is increasingly diverse because it raises the stakes that somebody who's very distant from you, that you had very little role in electing, becomes the most important person from a policy standpoint over your life. I'm very depressed. I had this depressing thought because we're getting early voting just opened in Tennessee, and I'm going to go early vote. And I realized in my entire life, I have not cast a meaningful vote for president of the United States. I've lived in a non-swing state. I've lived either in very blue states or very red states. And with the presidency growing in power, that means I have had zero real voice in electing the single most powerful branch of government. And that alienates people. That's something that causes people real. Now in Texas, that's not your case this year. Texas is, if the polls are correct, a swing state. Tennessee is not. So we need to de-escalate national politics. But there's also a heart change at issue. And I'll close with this. What is our vision for this country? What is our vision for it? James Madison in Federalist Number 10 said, the way we deal with the problem of the violence of faction is that we allow many factions to bloom and to flourish. George Washington, in almost 50 times in his writing, including a famous letter to a Hebrew congregation in Rhode Island, used a verse from the book of Micah that was repopularized in the musical Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda as part of Washington's farewell address. But that verse, Micah 4:4, says, every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one will make him afraid. And that's what George Washington was saying to the Jewish congregation in Rhode Island, to this historically persecuted religious minority, that in this country, that is our aspiration. And it's an aspiration we failed to achieve. No question about it. We failed to achieve it. But the fact of the matter is, our aspiration should be to tell every American, you can sit under your own vine and your own fig tree, and no one shall make you afraid. In other words, you have a place here. You have a place here. So that's the aspirational goal. Our means to achieving it. We often talk about policy, but we rarely talk about manner. We rarely talk about how we engage in the political square. And I love just sticking with the Micah theme. Micah 6:8 says, what does the Lord require of you, a man? What is good? It is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before the Lord your God. And I love those three interlocking requirements. Act justly. We can't forsake the commitment to justice. You absolutely cannot. No nation, no culture can long thrive if it forsakes a commitment to justice. But that justice must be tempered by mercy. We must have mercy and compassion, even for our political opponents. People who, for many reasons, may have good intentions and poor policies, or maybe they just are overwhelmed and they don't have the time to engage to the same extent that you do. We all learn. We're all in a learning process. Most of us can look back in our lives and say, I can't believe I said this. I can't believe I believed that. I can't believe I advocated for this. And a lot of us are on a journey, and that means that we need to have mercy for each other. We need to have some compassion for each other, even as we seek justice, and don't forsake the quest for justice. And then the last thing is walk humbly. A lot of these issues are incredibly complicated, just incredibly complicated. Let's take the issue of enduring racial injustice in this country. Whether we're going to talk about systemic racism or critical race theory, let's avoid like diving deep into the theory. Let's just talk for a minute about the reality of There was 345 years in the United States of America where racism was legally sanctioned and violently protected, with slavery moving into Jim Crow. 1964 began the process of allowing the use of the law to ameliorate de jure racism in this country. It began to turn the power of the state into an instrument. Didn't end it, but began the process of turning the power of the state to combat racism rather than advancing racism. Well, you don't fix 345 years of violently enforced racial injustice in 56 years of contentious change. And it's extremely complicated to figure out how to get from A to B and unwinding all of the legacies of those 345 years. It's extremely difficult. So we need to have some humility as we approach the public square about those things. I've spoken a lot about my book in the last month or so, and I did not expect this question, but almost everybody asked this question. Why should we stay together? Almost every interview I've had has had this question. Why should we stay together if we're getting this different? And I've got two answers to that. One is principled, one is pragmatic. The principled one is this. The fundamental American promise, even though we have failed to keep it for too many years in our history and still failed to keep it fully and completely today, is good. The Declaration of Independence, the fundamental idea of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that is a good thing. The Bill of Rights and the Civil War amendments, which try to give legal force to that mission statement, they're a good thing. And that in a nation that is built around these ideals, which are good, that we cannot be sure that the fragmentation of that nation would yield something better. Why not try to, and to quote, I believe President Obama, to achieve a more perfect union? Because the ideas are there. The goals are there. And where we have failed is we've often failed in not living up to the goals. It's not that the goals were wrong, that the values were wrong. We've failed to live up to those values. It seems better to seek to live up to those values rather than to fragment and the chaos and confusion of that, hope that something better would emerge from the ashes. The other thing is quite frankly, it's pragmatic. You lift the United States of America out of world affairs, and the world will not look. Their chances are very good that the world will not look the way we would want it to look. I know we have a lot of people who disdain globalization and disdain Americans' engagement overseas and disdain a lot of our economic power and our military influence and our alliances. But it has kept, since World War II, it has kept great power war at bay, which is an enormous gift to humanity and a gift to us, not just to humanity, but a gift to us. You lift that ability to keep that great power conflict at bay, and we may end up with a situation that threatens not just the lives and prosperity and health of countless millions around the globe, but us as well. That America pragmatically has a role to play in preserving this a global peace, not entire peace, but global peace against great power conflict, where we have presided over and have seen an extraordinary economic growth and thriving across the globe to such an extent that absolute poverty has been decreasing and decreasing and decreasing for year after year after year. So there's a principal reason these ideas are good, and there's a pragmatic reason that this nation is an indispensable nation for the global system that has led to an immense amount of human flourishing. That's why this nation should not perish from the face of the earth. But we got to prioritize unity. We have to prioritize fellowship, or we might see these trends tear us apart.
David, that was terrific. Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought there. For our audience, let me first say I highly do commend the book to you. You're getting a distillation of its wisdom here, but no substitute for getting the real thing. I happily got my well-read copy here. Why Did We Fall? Available at a bookstore near you, and yes, at the behemoth known as Amazon as well.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.